They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but mine was served at exactly 98 degrees in a courtroom where the man who destroyed my family sat sweating in his $1,500 suit while I held the evidence that would end him. My name is Sofia Ramirez, and I was 16 years old when immigration officers dragged my father out of our apartment at 5 in the morning. I remember the sound of boots on our stairs. I remember my little brother, Miguel, crying so hard he threw up on the carpet. I remember my mother's screams echoing through the hallway as they put handcuffs on Papa like he was some kind of criminal, when all he ever did was work 70-hour weeks at the construction site to give us a better life. That morning, I was just a scared kid in Hello Kitty pajamas watching my world collapse. 3 years later, I became the woman who burned down an empire. Let me take you back to the beginning. Back when I still believed in fairness and justice and the American dream my parents taught me about. I grew up in a tiny 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, New York. My father, Carlos Ramirez, came to this country when he was 23 years old with nothing but a backpack and a phone number for a cousin in Brooklyn. My mother, Rosa, crossed the border 2 years later. They met at a church social and fell in love over shared tamales and stories about the home they both missed. I was born a year after they got married, which made me a citizen. Miguel came 3 years later. We were a family. We were happy. Papa worked construction. He left before the sun came up and came home after it went down. His hands were always rough and scarred. Mama cleaned houses in Manhattan for rich people who barely looked at her. She took 2 trains and a bus to get to work every morning. They never complained. They told us we were lucky. They told us education was the key to everything. They told us if we worked hard enough, we could be anything we wanted. I believed them. I was a straight-A student at Benjamin Franklin High School. I was in the debate team. I tutored kids after school for extra money. I was going to be a lawyer. I was going to make my parents proud. I was going to prove that their sacrifice meant something. Then everything changed on a Tuesday morning in March. The knock on the door came at 5:15 a.m. I was already awake studying for a calculus test. I heard Papa get up to answer it. I heard him say, "Can I help you?" in his careful English. Then I heard the words that still give me nightmares. "Carlos Ramirez, you are under arrest for immigration violations." I ran out of my room. There were 4 ICE agents in our living room, big men with guns and badges and cold eyes. Papa stood there in his undershirt and work pants looking smaller than I had ever seen him. Mama was crying. Miguel was screaming. I tried to get to Papa, but an agent blocked me. "Let me see him," I shouted. "He didn't do anything wrong." The agent looked at me like I was invisible. They took him just like that. They put him in a van and drove away, and we never even got to say goodbye properly. The last thing I saw was Papa's face in the window looking back at us with tears running down his cheeks. We found out later that someone had reported him. Someone had called the ICE hotline and given them his name and address and work location. Someone had deliberately destroyed our family, but we did not know who. The next few weeks were a blur. Mama stopped eating. She cried constantly. Miguel stopped talking almost completely. He was only 13. He did not understand why Papa was gone. I had to be the one to hold it together. I had to be the adult. I called lawyers. Every single one told us the same thing. Without papers, Papa had no real defense. The best we could hope for was that he would not be deported immediately, that we would have time to say goodbye. The lawyers wanted $5,000 just to start. We did not have $5,000. We barely had $500. I dropped out of the debate team. I quit tutoring. I got a job at a diner working nights and weekends. Mama was falling apart, so I had to take care of Miguel. I had to make sure he ate and did his homework and got to school on time. I had to pay the rent because Mama could barely get out of bed some days. I had to become the parent. My grades started slipping. I stopped caring about calculus and chemistry and college applications. What was the point? My family was being ripped apart and no one seemed to care. Papa was being held at a detention center 2 hours away. We visited him twice before they deported him. The first time I barely recognized him. He had lost weight. His eyes were hollow. He kept apologizing to us over and over, saying he was sorry, saying he had failed us. I wanted to scream that he had not failed anyone, that this country had failed him. But I just held his hand through the glass partition and told him we loved him. The second visit was worse because we knew it was the last one. They were deporting him in 3 days, back to Mexico, back to a country he had not seen in 20 years, back to nothing. "Take care of your mother," he told me. "Take care of Miguel, be strong, Mija. I love you." Then he was gone. After Papa was deported, Mama got worse. She stopped going to work. We started getting behind on rent. I was working 40 hours a week at the diner and trying to go to school and take care of Miguel, and it was not enough. We were drowning. That is when I met Alina. Elena Vasquez was a social worker who came to check on us after Miguel's school counselor reported that he was having problems. She was in her 30s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She sat in our tiny kitchen and asked me questions about our situation. I told her everything. About Papa, about the bills, about how I was barely sleeping, about how scared I was that we were going to lose our apartment. "You are 16 years old," she said. "You should not have to carry all this." "I do not have a choice," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "There might be a way to help your father. There are organizations that fight deportations, lawyers who work pro bono, but I need to know something. Do you know why your father was targeted?" "What do you mean?" I asked. "ICE does not just randomly show up at people's doors at 5 in the morning, Alina said. Someone reported him. Someone gave them specific information. Do you have any idea who?" I had been so focused on survival that I had not really thought about it. But now that she mentioned it, I realized she was right. Someone had done this on purpose. Someone had destroyed my family deliberately. "I do not know," I said. "Papa never had problems with anyone. He kept to himself. He just worked." "What about his job?" Alina asked. "Any issues there?" I thought about it. Papa had worked for the same construction company for 8 years. Castellano Construction, run by a man named Richard Castellano. Papa had mentioned him a few times, always respectfully, always carefully. I suddenly remembered something Papa had said a few months before his arrest. "There was something," I said slowly. "Papa said his boss was doing something wrong, something with the books. He said he saw something he was not supposed to see." Elena leaned forward. "What did he see?" "I do not know exactly," I said. "Papa did not give me details, but he was worried. He said Mr. Castellano was stealing money somehow. Papa thought about reporting it, but he was scared he would lose his job." Elena's expression changed. "Sophia, if your father witnessed fraud and his boss found out, that could be motive. That could be why someone reported him to ICE." Something cold settled in my stomach. "You think his boss did this?" "I think it is worth investigating," Elena said. That conversation planted a seed, a dark, angry seed that grew in my chest over the next few weeks. I could not stop thinking about it. I started doing research. I looked up Richard Castellano online. He was exactly what you would expect. White guy in his 50s, big house in New Jersey, wife and 3 kids, respectable businessman, pillar of the community, and possibly the man who had destroyed my family to cover up his own crimes. I became obsessed. I needed to know for sure. I needed proof. I started digging. I created fake social media accounts and friend-requested people who worked at Castellano Construction. I joined local community groups where construction workers talked. I learned everything I could about Richard Castellano and his company. What I found made me sick. Richard Castellano was not just stealing from his company. He was running an elaborate scheme where he hired undocumented workers, paid them cash under the table, and then reported them to ICE when they asked for the wages they were owed. He had done it to at least a dozen workers over the past 5 years. He would get months of cheap labor, then make the workers disappear before he had to pay them. And because they were undocumented, they could not fight back. They could not report him. They just vanished. My father had been one of them. Papa had asked about the back pay he was owed. 3 months of overtime that Castellano had promised but never paid. Papa had kept careful records. He had receipts. And when he threatened to report the wage theft Castellano had him deported, I had my answer. I knew who had destroyed my family, and I knew why. But knowing was not enough. I needed proof. Real legal proof that would stand up in court, and I needed a plan. I spent the next year preparing. I turned 17, then 18. I graduated high school barely, but I did it. I got accepted to community college and started taking classes. Business classes, accounting classes. I learned everything I could about construction industry regulations and labor laws and financial fraud. I worked at the diner at night and studied during the day and took care of Miguel and Mama. I barely slept. I ran on rage and coffee and the need for justice. Elena helped me. She connected me with a lawyer named David Chen who worked for a non-profit that fought labor exploitation. I told him everything I had found about Castellano. He was interested but cautious. "We need solid evidence," he told me. "We need documents, financial records, testimony from other workers. Without that, it is just accusations." "I will get you evidence," I said. "How?" he asked. I smiled. "I am going to go work for him." David looked at me like I was crazy. Maybe I was, but I had a plan. Richard Castellano Construction was always hearing for office positions. They needed people to answer phones and file paperwork and do data entry. Low-level boring work that no one paid attention to. Perfect for someone who wanted to snoop around without being noticed. I applied under my mother's maiden name, Sofia Martinez. I used a friend's address so they would not connect me to Carlos Ramirez. I wore glasses and different makeup to my interview. I smiled and acted eager and grateful. I told them I was a college student looking for part-time work. They hired me on the spot. My first day at Castellano Construction was surreal. I walked into the building where the man who destroyed my family ran his business, and I smiled and said good morning and filed papers like I was any other employee. Richard Castellano walked past me in the hallway and did not even glance at me. I was invisible, just another young woman pushing papers. Exactly what I wanted. For the first few weeks, I did my job perfectly. I was early every day. I was efficient and pleasant and forgettable. I learned the layout of the office. I learned everyone's schedules. I learned where the important files were kept. I learned which employees had access to what. And I started collecting information. It was easier than I expected. Richard Castellano was arrogant. He thought he was untouchable. He kept 2 sets of books, one for the IRS and one real one that showed what he was actually doing. The real one was kept in a locked filing cabinet in his office, but his secretary had a key, and his secretary left her keys on her desk when she went to lunch. I made copies, slowly, carefully, over several weeks. I would wait until everyone was at lunch or in meetings. I would slip into the office. I would photograph pages with my phone. I documented everything. The cash payments to undocumented workers, the false reports to ICE, the wage theft, the tax fraud, all of it. I also started talking to other workers. Quietly, carefully. I would eat lunch with the guys from the construction crews. I would ask casual questions. I would listen to their stories. So many of them had been screwed over by Castellano. So many had friends or family who had been reported and deported. They were angry, but they were scared. They needed someone to go first. I told them I was collecting evidence. I told them there was a lawyer who would help. I told them we could fight back if we had enough people willing to testify. Slowly, I started building a case. It took me almost a year. 1 year of living a double life. 1 year of smiling at the man who destroyed my family while secretly building the case that would destroy him. 1 year of careful planning and sleepless nights and constant fear that I would be discovered. But I did it. I got everything David needed. Financial records. Testimony from 8 other workers who Castellano had exploited and reported. Evidence of systematic fraud and labor violations and immigration violations going back almost a decade. We filed the lawsuit on a Friday afternoon. David did it quietly without advance warning. We sued Richard Castellano and his company for wage theft, fraud, and conspiracy to violate immigration law. We submitted all the evidence to the Department of Labor and the IRS and immigration authorities. We went to the media. By Monday morning, it was everywhere. News vans outside Castellano Construction, articles about the construction boss who exploited immigrant workers, interviews with the workers I had found who were willing to speak out. It was a scandal. Richard Castellano held a press conference. He denied everything. He called us liars. He said this was a shakedown. He stood there in his expensive suit with his lawyers and his carefully practiced outrage, and he lied through his teeth. But we had the evidence. We had his own books showing what he had done. We had multiple witnesses. We had a paper trail he could not explain away. The authorities had to act. The investigation took 6 months. They froze his company's assets. They audited his finances. They interviewed dozens of workers. Richard Castellano's perfect life started crumbling. His wife left him. His business partners cut ties. His reputation was destroyed. The trial was set for the following spring. David told me it was going to be big, national media attention. This case could set precedents. It could change how immigration enforcement and labor law interacted. It could help a lot of people. But for me, it was personal. This was about Papa. This was about justice for my family. The trial lasted 3 weeks. I sat in that courtroom every single day. I watched Richard Castellano squirm in his seat as witness after witness testified about what he had done. I watched him try to maintain his dignity as his own financial records were read aloud, proving his fraud. I watched him realize he was going to lose. The day I testified was the most important day of my life. I wore a simple blue dress and I walked up to that witness stand and I looked Richard Castellano right in the eyes. And I told the truth. I told them about my father, about how hard he worked, about how Castellano had exploited him and then had him deported. I told them about the last 3 years, about how my family had suffered, about how I had become the adult overnight because this man could not stand the thought of paying honest wages for honest work. I told them about every document I had found, every record I had copied, every worker I had talked to. I laid out the entire conspiracy in careful detail. Richard Castellano's lawyer tried to shake me on cross-examination. He tried to make me seem like an angry kid with an agenda, but I stayed calm. I answered every question clearly. I let the evidence speak. When I stepped down from the witness stand, I walked past Richard Castellano. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the moment he recognized me, the moment he realized who I was, the moment he understood that the invisible girl who had filed papers in his office for a year was Carlos Ramirez's daughter. His face went white. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they came back with the verdict, I was holding Mama's hand so tight I thought I might break her fingers. Miguel sat on her other side. Elena and David sat behind us. The foreman stood up. We find the defendant Richard Castellano guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Mama started crying. Miguel hugged me. David was grinning. I just sat there feeling a weight lift off my chest that I had been carrying for 3 years. Richard Castellano was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. He was ordered to pay over $2 million in restitution to the workers he had exploited. His company was shut down. He lost everything. But more than that, the case opened up a broader investigation. Authorities started looking at other construction companies, other industries. The case became a landmark. It changed how immigration enforcement and labor violations were handled. It helped protect other workers from being exploited the same way. And my father came home. The evidence we presented proved that Papa's deportation had been the result of retaliation for witnessing fraud. David was able to get his deportation reversed. It took months of paperwork and hearings and bureaucratic nightmares, but he did it. Papa crossed back into the United States legally 14 months after the trial ended. We picked him up at the airport. I saw him walking through the arrival's gate, and I ran to him. I was 19 years old, and I cried like a little kid when he hugged me. "I am so proud of you, Mija," he whispered. "So proud." We went home, all of us together, Mama and Papa and Miguel and me, back to our tiny apartment in Queens that suddenly felt like a palace. We sat around the kitchen table and ate tamales and laughed and cried and told stories. We were a family again. It was not perfect. Papa had nightmares about the detention center. Mama still had anxiety. Miguel had years of therapy ahead of him. I was exhausted down to my bones. We all had scars that would never fully heal. But we had won. We had fought back against a system designed to crush people like us. We had stood up to power and we had won. I graduated from community college 2 years later with honors. I got accepted to law school. A good one, full scholarship. I am going to be a lawyer just like I always planned. But now I know exactly what kind of lawyer I want to be. I want to fight for families like mine, for people who have no voice, for workers who get exploited and thrown away. I want to be the person who stands up to the Richard Castellanos of the world and makes them pay. People ask me sometimes if I regret it, if I regret spending 3 years of my life consumed by revenge, if I wish I had just moved on and tried to heal. I tell them no. I tell them that what I did was not just revenge. It was justice. It was holding someone accountable. It was making sure that what happened to my family could not happen to anyone else. I tell them that sometimes being the adult means doing the hard thing, the scary thing, the thing that costs you sleep and peace and parts of yourself, but you do it anyway because it is right. I was 16 years old when they took my father. I was just a kid in Hello Kitty pajamas watching my world end. But I did not stay that kid. I became the person my family needed. I became the person who fought back. I became the person who won. My name is Sofia Ramirez. I am 21 years old, and this is my story. I want to tell you more about the in-between parts, the parts that do not make it into the news stories or the court transcripts, the messy, complicated reality of living through trauma while plotting justice. After Papa was deported, and before I started working at Castellano Construction, there was a period of about 6 months where I almost gave up. It was winter. The coldest winter New York had seen in years. Our apartment had terrible heating, and we could not afford to run it constantly. We huddled under blankets and wore layers of clothes indoors. Mama was getting worse. She stopped bathing regularly. She stopped answering the phone when Papa called from Mexico. She just stared at the wall for hours. I tried everything. I begged her to eat. I tried to get her to see a doctor. She refused. She said she wanted to die. That was the word she used. Die. Miguel heard her say it. He was 14 years old and he heard his mother say she wanted to die. He stopped coming out of his room after that. He stopped going to school. He just laid in bed with headphones on, ignoring the world. I was working double shifts at the diner. My boss, Rita, was this tough 60-year-old woman who had immigrated from Poland 30 years ago. She knew our situation. She paid me under the table so I could keep getting the little bit of government assistance we qualified for. She fed me leftover food from the kitchen. She probably saved my life. But even with Rita's help, we were barely surviving. We got an eviction notice. We had 30 days to pay 3 months of back rent or we were out. I did the math 100 times. There was no way. I could not make enough money. We were going to be homeless. I remember sitting on the fire escape outside our apartment at 3 in the morning smoking a cigarette I had stolen from Rita even though I did not smoke. I was looking at the city lights and thinking about how easy it would be to just let go, to stop fighting, to give up. Then my phone rang. It was Papa calling from Mexico. He called once a week on a borrowed phone. I almost did not answer. I was so tired, so defeated, but I did. Mija, his voice cracked. How are you? I started crying. I could not help it. I told him everything. About Mama, about Miguel, about the eviction notice, about how I could not do it anymore, about how I was failing everyone. Papa was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Sophia, do you remember what I told you when you were little, when you were learning to ride a bike? I did remember. I had been 7 years old and terrified of falling. Papa had run beside me holding the bike seat, saying over and over, I got you, Mija. I got you. You told me you had me, I said. And I let go, Papa said. Do you remember? I let go and you kept riding. You did not even realize I was not holding on anymore. You were doing it yourself. Papa, I whispered. I cannot hold you up right now, Mija, he said. I am not there, but you are already riding. You are already doing it. You do not need me to hold on. You are strong enough. Something shifted in me that night. Papa was right. I was already doing the impossible. I was keeping my family alive. I was going to school. I was working. I was surviving. I did not need anyone to hold me up. I was already flying. I went back inside and I made a plan. A real plan. I talked to Alina the next day. I told her about the eviction notice. She connected me with an emergency assistance program that paid 2 months of our back rent. She helped me find a free clinic that could see Mama. She got Miguel into a program at school for kids dealing with trauma. And she told me about David Chen and the possibility of going after Castellano. That was when the plan really formed. That was when I stopped just surviving and started fighting back. Working at Castellano Construction was a special kind of torture. Every day I had to smile at people who worked for the man who destroyed my family. I had to be cheerful and helpful and normal while rage burned in my chest constantly. There was this one woman, Janet, who worked in HR. She was nice to me. She brought me coffee sometimes and asked about my classes. She had no idea what her boss had done. She was just a middle-aged woman trying to pay her bills. I felt bad lying to her. But I could not tell anyone the truth. The worst days were when Richard Castellano would actually interact with me. It did not happen often. I was too low level for him to notice usually. But occasionally, he would ask me to make copies or file something or bring him coffee. I had to stand in his office looking at photos of his family and his fancy vacation spots and act normal while imagining all the ways I wanted to make him suffer. Once he was on the phone with someone bragging about a new boat he had bought. A boat. He bought a boat with the money he made exploiting workers like my father. I had to leave the room before I said something that would blow my cover. The hardest part was not telling anyone. I could not tell Rita at the diner. I could not tell my friends from school. I definitely could not tell Mama or Miguel. They could not know I was working for the man who had destroyed our family. They would have been terrified. They would have tried to stop me. Only Alina and David knew. They were my lifeline. I would meet with David every few weeks and give him the information I had collected. He would review it and tell me what else we needed. Alina would check in on me and make sure I was not falling apart. "You are playing a dangerous game," David told me once. "If Castellano figures out who you are before we are ready to file this case, you could be in real danger." "I know," I said. "Is it worth it?" he asked. I thought about Papa in Mexico, about Mama's hollow eyes, about Miguel's silence, about all the other families that had been destroyed the same way. "Yes," I said, "it is worth it." There were close calls. One time Janet from HR mentioned that they were doing background checks on all employees for an insurance thing. I panicked. If they did a real background check, they might connect me to Papa. I went to David and he made some calls. Somehow he got the background check company to flag my file as already completed. I never found out exactly how he did it, but it worked. Another time, Richard Castellano's son came into the office. He was around my age. Spoiled rich kid who worked for Daddy's company in some vague management role where he did not actually do anything. He hit on me, asked me out for drinks. I had to pretend to be flattered and make excuses. It made my skin crawl. This kid was living off the money his father had stolen from people like my parents, and he had no idea. Or maybe he did not care. The day we filed the lawsuit, I called in sick to work. I could not be there when it happened. I could not risk being in the office when Richard Castellano found out he was being sued. David filed the papers at 4 p.m. on a Friday. By 5 p.m., it was all over the news. I got a call from Janet at 6 p.m. She was crying. She said the office was in chaos, that federal agents had shown up, that Richard Castellano was screaming at everyone, that they were all being told to go home. She asked if I had heard what was happening. I played dumb. I said no. I said I hoped everything was okay. I hung up and turned off my phone. Then I went to the little church where Mama and Papa had met all those years ago. I lit a candle. I prayed. I thanked God for giving me the strength to do what needed to be done. I cried, and then I went home to tell my family what I had done. Mama's reaction was not what I expected. I thought she would be angry. I thought she would be scared. Instead, she pulled me into her arms and held me tight and said, "Your father would be so proud." Miguel just looked at me with wide eyes and said, "You are a superhero." I was not a superhero. I was just a girl who loved her family enough to fight for them. But if my little brother wanted to think I was a superhero, I was not going to argue. The months between filing the lawsuit and the trial were strange. The media attention was intense. Reporters wanted to interview me. I said no to most of them. David handled the press. But I did agree to do one interview with a woman from NPR who promised to be respectful and focus on the labor rights issues rather than just the drama. That interview aired nationally. People heard my story. I got messages from all over the country. Other families who had gone through similar things. Other workers who had been exploited. Lawyers who wanted to help. It was overwhelming but also amazing. I realized this case was bigger than just my family. It was part of something larger. Richard Castellano tried to fight back. His lawyers filed motions to dismiss. They tried to discredit me. They dug into my background looking for anything they could use. They found out I had worked for him under a different name. They tried to make that seem sinister. But David was ready. He argued that I had used my mother's maiden name, which was not illegal, that I had gotten the job on my own merit, that everything I had discovered was through legal means. The judge agreed. The other workers I had found started coming forward publicly. Men who had been too scared to speak out before saw that someone was fighting and decided to join. We ended up with 12 workers willing to testify. Each one had a story similar to Papa's. Each one had been exploited and discarded. The trial itself was grueling. Sitting in that courtroom day after day, listening to lawyers argue about my father's life like it was an abstract legal concept. Watching Richard Castellano sit there looking bored or annoyed like this was just an inconvenience. Seeing his lawyers try to paint Papa and the other workers as criminals who got what they deserved. But our side was stronger. David was brilliant. He presented the evidence methodically. He brought each worker up to testify. He showed the jury the 2 sets of books. He demonstrated the pattern of exploitation. He made it impossible to deny what Richard Castellano had done. When it was my turn to testify, I was terrified. I had prepared for weeks, but standing there with everyone staring at me and Richard Castellano's lawyer ready to attack was overwhelming. My hands were shaking. My voice cracked on my first answer. Then I looked at the jury. 12 ordinary people who were giving up their time to decide if what happened to my family mattered. I saw a woman about Mama's age in the front row. She smiled at me. Just a small, encouraging smile, and I found my voice. I told them everything, not just the facts, but the feelings, what it was like to be woken up by ICE agents, what it was like to watch my father being taken away, what it was like to become the adult overnight at 16, what it was like to see my mother give up on life, what it was like to realize that the system was not designed to protect people like us. I told them about the year I spent working at Castellano Construction, about smiling at the man who destroyed my family, about collecting evidence, about being so angry I could barely breathe sometimes, about being so scared I would be discovered. And I told them why I did it, not for revenge, not to get rich from a settlement, but for justice, for accountability, so that no other family would have to go through what we went through. Richard Castellano's lawyer tried to make me seem like I was lying, like I had some elaborate conspiracy. But I had the documents. I had the witnesses. I had the truth. He could not break me. When I finished testifying and walked back to my seat, Mama grabbed my hand and squeezed it. Papa was watching on a live stream from Mexico. He texted me, "I love you, Mija. You were perfect." The closing arguments happened 2 days later. David gave a passionate speech about justice and dignity and the rights of workers. Richard Castellano's lawyer gave a clinical speech about reasonable doubt and the burden of proof. Then we waited. Those 2 days of waiting for the verdict were the longest of my life. I could not eat. I could not sleep. I kept thinking about what would happen if we lost, if Richard Castellano walked away, if everything I had done was for nothing. But we did not lose. The jury came back guilty on all counts, and that moment when the foreman said the words "guilty" was the moment I finally exhaled, finally let myself believe that justice was possible. Richard Castellano's face when the verdict was read will stay with me forever. He looked genuinely shocked, like he really believed he was going to get away with it, like he could not comprehend that there were consequences for his actions. He looked at me and I looked right back at him. I wanted him to see that I was not afraid, that he had not broken us, that we had won. The sentencing hearing 2 months later was cathartic. The judge was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who had clearly read every document in the case. She gave a speech before announcing the sentence about how the exploitation of vulnerable workers undermined the entire legal system, about how people like Richard Castellano, who used the law as a weapon to hide their crimes, deserved no mercy. 8 years in federal prison, $2 million in restitution, the maximum sentence possible. Richard Castellano tried to maintain his dignity as they took him away, but I saw him crying. I felt no sympathy. He had destroyed so many lives without remorse. He deserved everything he got. After the sentencing, we had a small celebration at Alina's apartment. Just our family and Alina and David and a few of the other workers who had testified. We ate pizza and drank cheap champagne and laughed and cried. Miguel made a toast. He was 16 now. Almost the age I had been when this all started. To Sophia, he said, the bravest person I know. Everyone drank. I felt embarrassed and proud and exhausted and happy all at once. Getting Papa home was another battle. A smaller one, but still difficult. David filed all the paperwork to get the deportation reversed. He argued that Papa had been the victim of witness retaliation, that his deportation was illegal. The immigration court agreed, but the process still took over a year. Bureaucracy moves slowly even when justice is on your side. I visited Papa in Mexico twice during that year. Mama and Miguel came with me the second time. It was strange being in the country my parents had left, meeting Papa's relatives who I barely knew, seeing the poverty they had escaped from, understanding better why they had risked everything to come to America. Papa showed me the town where he grew up, the tiny house with the dirt floor, the school he had dropped out of at 12 to work, the church where he had prayed for a better future. He told me stories about his childhood, about the hunger, about the violence, about the lack of opportunity. I wanted more for you, he said. That is why we came. That is why we sacrificed, so you could have choices I never had. I know, Papa, I said. And look, your sacrifice mattered. I am going to law school. Miguel is going to college. We made it. He cried, happy tears this time. When Papa finally came home, it was like a missing piece of our family clicking back into place. He looked older, thinner, but his eyes had light in them again. He hugged each of us for a long time. We took him back to our apartment and he just walked around touching things. The furniture, the walls, the pictures on the refrigerator, like he was making sure it was real. That night we all slept in the living room together, like we used to do when Miguel and I were little. We just wanted to be close, to be a family again. Things are not perfect. Papa has PTSD from his time in detention. He wakes up screaming sometimes. Mama still has bad days where she can barely function. Miguel is in therapy working through years of trauma. I have anxiety that probably needs treatment, but I have not had time to deal with it yet. But we are together, and we are fighting. Papa got his job back with a different construction company, one that treats workers with respect. Mama started cleaning houses again, but now she has legal protections and fair wages. Miguel is a senior in high school with good grades and college applications out. I am in my second year of law school. The case changed things beyond our family, too. The investigation we started led to reforms in how immigration enforcement and labor violations intersect. Several other construction companies were investigated and shut down. Workers have more protections now. It is not perfect, but it is better. I get messages sometimes from people who heard about the case. Workers who were being exploited, who found the courage to report it, because they saw that someone fought back and won. Families who lost someone to deportation, who are now fighting to bring them home. People who were inspired to stand up against injustice. That is when I know it was worth it. When I see that our pain, our struggle meant something bigger than just us. Law school is hard. I am not going to pretend otherwise. I am studying immigration law and labor law and civil rights. I am working as an intern at David's nonprofit. I am learning how to be the kind of lawyer who fights for people who have no voice. Sometimes I think about the girl I was at 16. The girl in Hello Kitty pajamas watching her father being dragged away. I think about how scared and powerless I felt, how I thought my life was over. I wish I could go back and tell that girl that she was stronger than she knew, that she was going to survive this. that she was going to fight back and win, that she was going to change things. But I could not go back. I can only go forward. I am Sofia Ramirez. I am 21 years old. I was 16 when they deported my father, and I had to become the adult overnight. I spent 3 years fighting for justice, and I won. This is my story, but it is also the story of every immigrant family that has been torn apart by a broken system, every worker who has been exploited and silenced, every person who has been treated as disposable. We are not disposable. We matter. Our lives matter. Our families matter. And when someone tries to destroy us, we have the right to fight back. That is what I learned. That is what I want people to know. Justice is not something that just happens. It is something you have to fight for, something you have to sacrifice for, something you have to be willing to lose yourself over. But it is possible, even when you are just a scared kid with no power and no resources and no reason to hope, even when the system is rigged against you, even when everyone tells you to give up. You can fight, and you can win.
I did. We did. And if we could do it, anyone can. That is my story. That is my truth. That is my revenge. Not the kind of revenge that hurts people for the sake of hurting them, but the kind that holds people accountable, that demands justice, that says you cannot destroy families without consequences. Richard Castellano is in prison. My father is home. My family is healing. And I am becoming the person I always wanted to be. The fight is not over. There are still so many families being torn apart, so many workers being exploited, so many people suffering because the system treats them as less than human. But now I know how to fight. I know it is possible to win, and I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure that what happened to my family does not happen to anyone else. That is the promise I made to Papa, to Mama, to Miguel, to myself. That is the promise I intend to keep. My name is Sofia Ramirez. This is my story. If like this story, then don't forget to like and subscribe.